Well, hello. Welcome to Wicked Words. I'm Brooke, and this is the podcast where you get to listen to my terrible New England accent while I talk about some dark topics that interest me. Today, we're going to be discussing the case of Melinda Pleskovic. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this case, but I just heard of it the other day. I was listening to the interrogation footage, and it caught my attention immediately. I was sunk into a rabbit hole for about 4 hours just watching the interrogation footage, and then started doing a bunch of research. And I ended up putting together a little script, and I figure I'll read that script for you guys, and I'll try to hold off with my opinions and make it as unbiased as possible. I'll probably add my thoughts at the end, and we'll see how it goes. All feedback is welcome, because obviously this being my first episode, I've never done this before. So let's begin. Many girls dream of their wedding day, and Anna Pleskovic was lucky enough to have her mom Melinda by her side, helping her plan her upcoming October nuptials to her high school sweetheart. Anna and her fiancé Jeff lived in the basement of the Pleskovic home on Blazing Star Drive, along with their infant daughter, Aurora. Melinda and her husband Bruce lived in this neighborhood for almost 2 decades, and they knew that Strongsville was the perfect place to raise a child since they had raised their 3 there. As the day of the wedding approached, anxiety ran high in the house. But nobody was expecting that a day they had spent so long planning to be a spectacular celebration of love would end up being a day of dread and mourning they'd never forget. While there isn't a whole lot of public information available about her early life, Melinda Jane Showman was born on January 5th, 1968, to George Michael Lloyd and Opal Brundage Showman. It seems she may have been the youngest of her 4 siblings, being raised by her older sister Juanita and her husband Carl Leese of Toledo, Missouri. Melinda, or Mel as she was often called, graduated from Lutheran South High School in St. Louis before attending Baldwin Wallace University in Berea, Ohio. There she obtained her master's degree in education in addition to playing soccer. And during this time, Melinda met and fell deeply in love with Bruce Pleskovic. The pair married in July of 1992, and it wasn't long before Mel and Bruce were expecting their first child, a daughter that they named Megan. Megan's birth was soon followed by another pregnancy, and in 1997, Anna was born. Not feeling that their family was quite complete just yet, 2 years later, they had a son named Kyle, and their son Kyle was born with Down syndrome. Mel and Bruce were well known in their town. Mrs. P, as she was called, joined the Strongsville school system in 1990 and was an extremely beloved 6th grade teacher and a community sports coach. Bruce was an accountant at a nearby bank, and the two were sociable, preferring to dine at local places and spend time on the water. The couple had recently purchased a boat to work on together, with Bruce fixing the mechanicals and Mel upholstering the seats. After 25 years of marriage, it was just the thing they enjoyed doing. They were excited that their middle child was preparing for a lifetime of happiness, just like them, and it was said that Melinda especially was ecstatic, eagerly assisting Anna with every wedding detail. Meanwhile, Jeff seemed too busy to take part in planning, and always had an excuse. It was beginning to put a damper on the Pleskovic spark. Mel and Bruce couldn't help but feel as though there was always a dark cloud that followed Jeff everywhere he went, including their home. While there isn't much known about Melinda, there seems to be even less known about Jeff. Jeffrey William Scullin Jr. was born on April 10, 1997, in Brooklyn, Ohio, to Laverne Kayla Wilson and Jeffrey Scullin Sr., who had married only 9 months earlier. During Jeff Jr.'s freshman year of high school, he was woken in the middle of the night to police. Confused, he was told his father had accidentally shot himself in the mouth. Jeff Sr. survived, and he continued to own firearms, using them as a way to bond with Jeff and his younger sister Ellie. A friend of Jeff's stated that he had problems with his family throughout high school. These problems were never elaborated on. In September 2016, when Jeff was 19, his mother filed for divorce, obtaining a restraining order on grounds of domestic violence. But only 6 months later, she would ask the judge to dismiss the case. This turbulent upbringing could have contributed to the bad vibe that Mel and Bruce got from Jeff, but being the good-natured people they were, they looked past his rough exterior and gave him another chance. It was on Mel's 48th birthday when Anna announced she was pregnant, and shortly after Jeff moved into the Pleskovic home. Bruce and Melinda gladly gave up their basement so the new family could have a space of their own, rent-free, while they worked on buying a home. Anna found a job as a server at Applebee's, while Jeff worked as a service technician for an HVAC company. The summer that Jeff moved in, things around the house began to go missing. And one day, while Jeff and Anna were home alone, Jeff noticed something strange in the backyard. 4 guys standing and staring at the house. He called Anna over, and when she came to check it out, she noticed they appeared to be smoking marijuana. But it wasn't until one of them began messing with the trampoline that Anna decided to call the cops. By the time the police arrived, the strangers had run off. After this, Jeff was woken in the middle of the night to somebody kicking at the back door. When he ran to check it, he was able to see what looked like the same men running off. He called the police, and again, nobody was in the area by the time they arrived. These odd occurrences continued to happen into the fall, and one day while Anna was home alone with the baby, she heard what sounded like somebody trying to open the back sliding door. When she went to go check, she saw an unknown man pressed against the glass, and when he spotted her, he ducked. Taking no chances, Anna grabbed Aurora and locked herself in the room, calling 911. And again, when they arrived, there was nobody around. By winter, the events were escalating. In January 2017, Bruce's car was broken into, his laptop and car keys stolen. And when summer rolled around, the strange men returned, standing in the yard, staring at the Pleskovic home, fleeing right before police arrived, almost like clockwork. In August, there was another attempted break-in, while Anna and Aurora were home, but this time, Melinda was there too. Her car keys were stolen just like Bruce's had been the prior winter, and after this incident, someone began to set off the Pleskovic's car alarms randomly throughout the night and early morning. Feeling at their wits' end, Jeff suggested they install security cameras. Mel agreed, but Bruce was skeptical. He had lived in this neighborhood for years, and he sensed that there was something else going on. He just couldn't place his finger on it. Even with Jeff home most days since being laid off, items continued to go missing. And in October, while Jeff was home alone, an unknown man tried to open the back door. He was scared away by Jeff's dog, and Jeff immediately called the police, watching the would-be intruder escape through the bushes. The family was shaken, but attempted to keep focus on Jeff and Anna's quickly arriving big day. In fact, it had been just that exact day that the venue called to let Melinda know that Jeff's credit card had been declined, and they would need a payment by the end of that weekend to avoid cancellation. When Mel asked Jeff about it, he calmed her nerves, telling her that there was got to be an issue with the bank, and he'll take care of it. The following day, Jeff was in a minor car accident while helping a friend move, and he ended up stuck at the hospital while getting his broken thumb reset, unable to get the cash for the wedding. He assured Anna and Mel that he would get the money the next day, but as the clock ticked, Jeff explained that a hot water heater at one of his rental properties exploded, and he was forced to buy a new one. This meant he would be unable to get the money for the wedding that day too. Frustrated, Mel and Bruce decided they needed to take matters into their own hands to prevent their daughter's dream day from being canceled. The two loaded Anna and Kyle into the car, and they headed to the venue to pay off the balance. Jeff told them that he would pay them back the following day at dinner, his treat, and he would even welcome his parents to join them. His parents had seemed avoidant of the Pleskovics, so reluctantly, Mel and Bruce believed him. Upon returning home from the wedding venue, the group discovered there were several nails hammered into Bruce's tire. Knowing that he had work the following day, Bruce just replaced it with the spare and decided to deal with it later. October 23rd, 2017. This day started like every other in Bruce's life. It was pretty routine. He woke up, showered, woke up Kyle, got him ready for his day, and by the time they came downstairs, Mel had breakfast and coffee ready. Bruce would take off before Kyle's bus arrived to avoid getting stuck in traffic, and he said goodbye to his wife and son. After getting Kyle on the bus, Melinda received a call from her husband. The spare tire hadn't made the trip. He was stuck on the side of the highway, and he needed her to pick him up. She took her minivan to retrieve him, returning to the house so he could repair the tire. Megan would take Bruce and the tire back to his car in Mel's minivan, while Mel went about her day using Megan's car instead. About mid-morning, Anna woke up, alarms blaring. She had hoped to wake up a bit earlier to spend some time on her hair, but it would just have to be braided, she thought to herself. She woke Jeff up so he could take care of Aurora since she was due at work. After saying goodbye, Jeff fed Aurora, pulled out her toys, and threw on some cartoons while he lounged on the couch until Melinda came home. Mel went upstairs to change her shirt, returning to the kitchen to greet Aurora and Jeff. Mel told Jeff she wouldn't be able to make their dinner plans with his parents that night, and she asked if he was able to pick up the reimbursement from his mother later that day. He agreed to go when she returned to come home from her doctor's appointment. And with this, the conversation ended, and Mel left. At exactly 3 p.m., Kyle's bus arrived, and Jeff stood outside with him and Aurora kicking puddles for a few minutes until Melinda pulled in, back from her doctor's appointment. She brought Kyle inside, and Jeff hopped in his truck with the baby, making it only about a mile down the road before his truck ran out of gas. Unable to find his phone, Jeff began to panic, uncertain of what to do next. He decided to put Aurora in her stroller and walk in the pouring rain with a gas can to the station down the road. Just at that moment, a Good Samaritan in a red Lincoln pulled over and asked Jeff if he needed help. Jeff gave him $10 in the canister and asked if he could run up the street to the gas station. The old man obliged and took off. Jeff sat in the car with Aurora to get out of the rain, and he wondered if he was going to get ripped off. But a wave of relief hit him when the man returned with a full gas can. Jeff thanked him and filled up the gas can just enough to make it to the station, where he could take the few dollars that were in his cup holder and add it to his tank. While under the cover of the awning, Jeff began to search through the back seat for his phone, knowing it had probably slipped through the center console like it had done in the past. He breathed another sigh of relief when he found it under a collection of items on the floor in his back seat. He texted his Aunt Jeannie to let her know he was on his way. When he arrived at his aunt's house, Jeff called his father. He knew he wouldn't be able to do any yard work for her, but she appreciated the visit nonetheless. They discussed what she'd wanted done when the weather was cleared, and they talked about Jeff Sr.'s recent hospital visit for an infected hand. They also discussed the latest attempted robbery, and Jeff bragged about how his dog bit the intruder, scaring him off. Jeannie was horrified, but she was thankful that nobody was hurt. He wasn't there long before Jeff said goodbye, called his father again, and took off back to the Pleskovic home. He wanted to change out of his wet clothing before meeting for dinner, but he was unable to get into the house. Without keys, and nobody was answering the door, Jeff shrugged it off and left. Bruce was finishing up at his desk for the day when he received a message from his wife's phone. "Meet me at Brew Kettle." Confused, Bruce replied, letting her know that he would be leaving soon. It seemed like a strange message for Mel to send, especially since they had just eaten at the Brew Kettle the night before, and it wasn't her favorite place by any means. Pulling up to the restaurant, Bruce didn't see Megan's car, but he thought to himself, maybe she's still on her way. He decided to wait in the lobby, but after 15 minutes or so, Mel still hadn't arrived. Bruce texted his wife that he was going to head to Walmart, kill some time, and pick up some things they needed. He still didn't receive any response. When he was leaving Walmart, he called Mel, but it went straight to voicemail. He texted her, and again he got no response. He did, however, get a call from Anna. She mentioned that she hadn't heard from Mel that day, but she did receive an invite from Jeff to go to Applebee's. Bruce was even more confused, because he was pretty sure that Mel was supposed to meet Jeff's mother there. But then she texted him about Brew Kettle, and now this? After a bit of persuading from his daughter, he told her that he was going to go to the rec center to work out, and he would be at Applebee's afterwards. He texted his wife the new game plan, and he didn't receive any acknowledgement. Plans were always changing, and Bruce was usually the last to know. So maybe Melinda had spoken to Jeff and asked him to relay the message to Bruce and Anna. Bruce did have a few missed calls from Jeff. When he returned the call and let Jeff know that he had accepted the invite to Applebee's, he explained that he would be there after his workout. When Bruce arrived at the restaurant, Jeff was already there, eating appetizers and having a drink. Bruce ordered a burger and a $1 margarita and sat down, making small talk with Jeff. He mentioned that he hadn't heard from Melinda, and Bruce commented that he hoped nothing had happened to her. Jeff told him, "Don't think like that," and they finished their meals with Anna as their server. The men left the restaurant together, Bruce carrying Jeff's takeout containers for him. He placed the containers on the dashboard and stood in the gap of the passenger's seat door. Jeff had placed the baby's car seat on the bench of his truck while he poured the remaining gas into the tank, mentioning to Bruce that he had to stop at his father's garage earlier that day to pick up the can. Bruce could only think about the smell of the gasoline and the baby inhaling it, though. When he was done, both men took off in their own respective vehicles, heading to the same destination. Bruce made it home before Jeff, though, and as he pulled into the driveway, his headlights illuminated Megan's car. He thought to himself, how strange. Mel's clearly home, but she's not answering her phone. The lights in the house are on. They knocked as the door was locked, and Jeff tried his key unsuccessfully, subsequently ringing the doorbell several times. Unexpectedly, Kyle opened the door. Bruce entered the house, calling out for Melinda, entering the kitchen. Jeff trailed after him, dropping the baby's car seat at the door. As he returned to the truck to get the rest of his stuff, he could hear Bruce abruptly scream. Worried, he jogged back into the house. Assuming that something had happened to the baby, Jeff instinctively looked for the baby's car seat, finally spotting it in the family room. Why is he screaming? The baby's fine, Jeff thought to himself, before turning around and noticing Bruce standing over Mel's bloodied and battered body. Call 911, Jeff said. He grabbed Aurora's car seat and the scruff of Kyle's shirt, and he took the kids outside to the truck, where he knew they would be safe. Jeff called emergency services himself and rapidly tried to explain the situation to the dispatcher between heavy breaths. Police would later reveal that Melinda had been stabbed to death, while Kyle was nearby in the home. The depravity of such a crime shook Strongsville to its core. Who could do such a thing, especially to somebody who was so revered in the community? On October 28, 2017, the day Anna and Jeff were set to be married, he dressed himself in a suit and tie, but instead of standing at an altar as a groom, he was set to serve as a pallbearer for the woman who should have become his mother-in-law that day. Sadly, the Pleskovics said their final goodbye to the matriarch of their family. It took Strongsville Police Department only 4 days to solve Melinda's heinous murder, though, and it was the initial interviews with the family that almost immediately shined a light on their suspect. There were rumors around town that somebody in the Pleskovic family didn't like Mel as much as they had claimed to police. While Bruce and Anna were considering a drug-addicted friend or a neighbor who could have been responsible, Jeff was considering Bruce. Bruce, who he said often drank and would get belligerent. These outbursts sometimes requiring the family to leave the house until Bruce was able to calm himself down. A search warrant was issued for the property, the cars in the driveway, and the cell phones of everyone involved. While combing through one of the vehicles, a tactical knife was found, and it had what appeared to be blood on it. The Strongsville police submitted the weapon to the medical examiner's office for DNA testing, and at this point, they invited the family back for further questioning. After receiving the medical examiner's report, they placed their alleged perpetrator under arrest. On October 31st, 2017, Jeffrey William Scullin Jr. was placed in handcuffs and charged with several counts, one for murdering his future mother-in-law, one for aggravated murder, 2 counts of felonious assault, 1 count of tampering with evidence, 1 count of making false police reports, and 1 count of child endangerment. His bond was set at $1 million. The FBI interviewed Scullin after his arrest and conducted a polygraph test, which he was alleged to have failed. The polygrapher urged him to confess, working with him to write a note to Aurora for her to read when she grew up. Jeffrey refused to apologize, though, claiming that he couldn't remember anything that happened, despite it happening just a week before. Jeff primarily caught police's attention during the first interview. It was decided that he was somewhat of a pathological liar, and while they try not to judge the expression of grief, Jeff was described as eerily calm and unaffected by Mel's death. He was anxious to get the interview with police over with as soon as possible, rather than exuding a desire to find Mel's killer. Towards the end of his questioning, Jeff even asked the officer if he had any information about his dog or his dad's car, but at no point did he ask about Mel. His total affect was entirely off-putting, and when paired with the proven inconsistencies, Jeff became their main suspect. His timeline didn't make sense, and it didn't fit with Bruce and Anna's recollection from that day. There were too many small discrepancies for Strongsville police to ignore, and they dug deeper to get to the root of the story. One of the biggest red flags from Jeff's initial interviews was when he nervously mentioned to the detective that there was a possibility that there could be gunpowder residue on his hands because he had handled one of his father's guns in the prior days. The funny thing is, police hadn't disclosed to the family that Melinda had been shot. That wasn't the only thing that Jeff said during questioning that caught police's attention, though. He seemed to have trouble keeping his story straight, and he changed details a few times. There was also a gap of time that Jeff just couldn't account for, no matter how hard he tried. The detectives presented overwhelming evidence proving Jeff was lying. He was never at the gas station. He didn't arrive at his aunt's house until hours after he claimed, and he only stayed for a very brief time, leaving to go meet Bruce at Applebee's. Jeff's parents had no idea about a supposed meeting at the restaurant, or any reimbursement. The police checked camera footage from a nearby playground, and they were unable to corroborate the alleged break-ins that occurred while Jeff was home alone just days before the murder. The coup de grace for Jeff was the tactical knife that was found in his truck. It had Melinda's blood on the blade and Jeff's DNA on the handle. Mel's blood was also found on the passenger side door handle of Jeff's truck. At last, Jeff relented, at least just a little. He explained to police that he was worried about the wedding. When Anna was 6 months pregnant, he uncovered there was a possibility Aurora was not his child. and he told Anna that he would not marry her unless the paternity test had proved the baby was his. So when she complied and the results showed that he was in fact the father, Jeff was left in a situation where he was laid off and didn't have enough money to pay for a wedding he may not have planned to go through with. He told detectives that he talked about taking the money from his retirement fund, but he knew that he didn't have enough money in the account and he would end up owing penalty fees and early withdrawal and taxes. But he didn't want to owe the Pleskovics money. He felt this would cause problems. Jeff hadn't figured out a solution to his problem when on the afternoon of the 23rd, Melinda began nagging him about the wedding. She went downstairs, and when she returned, she had the knife, a gun, and the paternity test. She confronted Jeff, yelling that he wasn't Aurora's father. Jeff grabbed the baby and placed her in the truck, returning to the house to grab his stuff, his keys, his phone, his wallet, and putting those things in the truck with Aurora. When he returned to the house for a third time, Melinda was still screaming, telling him that he couldn't take the baby. Jeff declared he was Aurora's father, and that's when Mel pointed the gun in his direction. Jeff told her to stop, and then he attempted to grab the gun. During the scuffle, the weapon went off, and after that, Jeff blacked out, losing all control, and he couldn't remember what happened. He could just remember hiding the gun in a bag in the basement before locking the door and leaving. This story is obviously fabricated. Jeff stabbed Melinda upwards of 35 times and shot her 3 times, with a 4th bullet missing her. He then left her mentally disabled son with her dead body as he went to have dinner and drinks with her husband, whom he would later that night suggest to police may have had something to do with his wife's murder. He even served as a pallbearer at her funeral. The mental defect in this person is just beyond description. Before the police questioning, Jeff asked Bruce what he thought that they should do about the wedding. And Bruce was stunned, as he was consumed from the fact that he had just found his best friend, his wife of 25 years, brutally murdered in their home. Jeff then suggested that the family download a GPS tracking app on their phone. Bruce's instincts were telling him that Jeff had something to do with Mel's death, but he didn't want to think that his granddaughter's father could be capable of something to this caliber. Little did the Pleskovics know, Jeff was not the person they thought he was at all. He had choreographed every single attempted break-in, hiring friends or homeless people, and sometimes even playing the part himself. Jeff was causing the family to feel unsafe in their own home for his own enjoyment. He resented the family, feeling as though Bruce was a drunk who would complain that Jeff didn't do things to his standards. And Mel was always yelling at everyone. She was a very confrontational person who would make comments about Jeff's weight. Kyle was jealous of Aurora and would hurt her. And Anna had cheated on him. Jeff felt justified in doing what he was doing, and he thought it would set up an alibi for the second part of his plan. Jeff wasn't going to drain his retirement fund for the wedding. He would make it so they would have to call it off. First, he made half-hearted attempts, forcing Anna to prove Aurora was his baby. When that didn't work the way he had planned, he thought he could drag his feet on paying, resulting in the wedding being canceled. The problem was, Jeff didn't realize that the Pleskovics would band together. He didn't understand that was how family is supposed to be in tough times. Jeff had such a jaded view of them. Bruce was said to be a loving and hard-working father dedicated to his family, and while he may have enjoyed a drink to unwind, he was not an alcoholic. Anna was like a caring mother who supported her little family while her fiancé was laid off. She was a proud mother, describing her daughter to detectives in her interview, and Anna denied that Kyle was ever jealous of the baby, stating baby was one of the few words he did speak. Mel was described as selfless, inspirational, and deeply devoted by those who knew her. She was not this mad woman that Jeff attempted to portray her as to police. She also suffered from arthritis and fibromyalgia, so she was not in any position to defend herself against Jeff's attacks. Not that she would have expected them. Originally, Jeff pled not guilty, even denying a plea deal made by the prosecutor. It wasn't until his motion to suppress evidence was denied that he decided to change his plea to no contest, maintaining his innocence but accepting that there's enough evidence to convict him of a crime. The evidence that they attempted to suppress was his failed polygraph results, his confession to police, and the bloody knife with his DNA on it found in his truck. Jeff claimed that there were sensitive topics that would come out in trial that he wanted to spare the family the trauma of. So he was willing to do the time until his appeals were heard. Over 50 people submitted victim impact statements to the court, and Anna stood up at the podium and read hers. She called Jeff a boy, not worthy to be called a man. She described him as a sociopath, while her sister called him a selfish, sadistic monster. Megan recalled Melinda being the kind of mother who would drive 5 hours to watch her daughter's softball game, while Bruce struggled to even explain the impact his wife's death has had on his family. Somehow support for Scullin survives in Strongsville, with anonymous friends telling media that there's more to this story. Those who had known him before claim he was a loving, honest, family type of guy. The community at large has kept Melinda's memory alive, though, and the family gave out a $1,000 scholarship raised through a soccer event they held in Mel's honor. They also continued to involve themselves with the Special Olympics, which was something that she was very passionate about. And you can even check out the hashtag #It'sOnMel and see acts of kindness that others were inspired to perform to pay respect to a woman who was so inclusive and motivating. And while Mel may not be alive, she certainly lives on in spirit. There are some things that I found during research that I just couldn't work into the podcast, but I still wanted to talk about them now. And some of these things include Jeff had at some point claimed that he was in the process of buying a house. And when Bruce asked him who their financer was, just out of curiosity, Jeff explained that he had cash that his great-grandmother had left over to him, and he was going to use that to buy the house. But he didn't have money for the wedding. And when Bruce and Mel looked into this house, they noticed that it said it was foreclosed on and not pending sale. So that was sort of a red flag. Also, during Jeff's interview with police, it's mentioned that the backsliding glass door was partially open, and he claims that this isn't normal behavior, that it is broken, but they usually use something to try and wedge it shut. I think that it's not sure whether Kyle or Jeff opened it, but I'm going to go out on a limb and say that it's possible Jeff opened it as a way to set up an implication that maybe whoever tried to break in, the day before, had come in and done this. And one of the reason I brought this up is because one of the interesting things is Melinda's dog was actually found wandering the street, but Jeff's dog was found in his kennel, locked up. Just another little kind of dig at the family. It's not bad enough that the mother is murdered, but the dog also goes missing. And he also makes a comment about the dog being useless, which the detective even says it. He's an old dog, He just seems to have very, very negative views of every single person in this family, including the dog. Another thing I thought was interesting was Jeff was able to very clearly give a detailed description of what the perpetrator, the alleged intruder, was wearing. He said he was wearing a blue Hollister hoodie that had white writing arched over and black and white mesh sweatpants. But he didn't see the guy's face. He couldn't give them any indication of what this person looked like. I thought it was very interesting that he brought up sweatpants specifically, because afterwards the police would search the basement and they would find a pair of bloody sweatpants that Jeff had worn, and they had Melinda's blood on them. Something else I thought interesting was he mentions during questioning to the police that there are times his dog has a long leash on and he will run around and get tangled in the legs of the kitchen chairs, knocking them over. One of the things Bruce noticed right away when he walked into the house that night was an overturned chair. And it made me think that perhaps this overturned chair was a sound that Jeff connected in his head to this event. And he was using this detail now as a way to, I guess, explain the chair being fallen. I don't know. He tries to come up with explanations for almost every detail. And it's very suspicious, because it doesn't seem like something that an innocent person would be doing, like looking for these things, like trying to explain them away. Rather, in Bruce's interrogation, he sees these things and he's not trying to explain them away. He's just trying to find an answer as to why. And that's what really caught my attention with this case, was the huge difference between the demeanor of Bruce and Jeff in these interrogations. And you could really see how Bruce was connecting the dots and how he was truly upset. But Jeff just seems so emotionless and so cold. It was very, very intriguing, and I totally suggest you check out these videos. And again, as I mentioned before, it seemed like he's trying to connect these things in his head. He mentions to police finding his phone in the back seat under a collection of items. This is where police ended up finding the tactical knife under a collection of items in the back seat. And then there are just some other things that the little inconsistencies police will bring up. Jeff will say that he went to his aunt's house at a certain time, but he really didn't. Just things like that. He also mentions the fender bender, and while they're speaking about that, he's unable to give the detectives any idea as to where this fender bender even occurred. There was no information exchanged. It's very, very suspicious. And during this conversation, he says that he was in a hit and run prior to this. So he's got a lot of stories. And throughout the interrogation, he tends to ask the police a lot, am I in trouble for doing this? About small things, like, am I in trouble for not telling my mom that, we had planned Applebee's dinner, I was going to surprise her? Or was it wrong of me not to report the fender bender? It's very small things that he's trying to see if the detective will give him approval, and it's just not normal behavior for somebody who is innocent. So he does a very poor job at portraying himself as being an innocent person. And lastly, the thing that I wanted to discuss is he seems very childlike in that sense. And I feel like this could have something to do with the issues that happened in Jeff's childhood that were discussed. His dad, shooting himself. This is even mentioned during the interrogation, and it's brought up as an accidental shooting. But when Bruce discusses it, he mentions his dad did try committing suicide. Jeff just can't even accept that. It's been almost a decade since it happened, and he still just can't even admit that. It's very odd behavior, and I think that his parents' relationship, and that divorce had something to do with a catalyst to this behavior, because it coincided so perfectly with when these weird alleged break-ins would happen at the Pleskovic's house. It was very off. And it's very good police work on the behalf of Strongsville, Ohio. They did a wonderful job on this case, and my heart goes out to the Pleskovic family, because watching their interrogation footage, like I could see Anna interacting with one of the canines. It was such a wholesome moment, knowing that her life had just been changed in such a drastic way. It was, little things like that you really get a sense for who this family is. And watching the, reports that they talk about Mel, and it's so sad to think that Aurora is going to grow up without her grandmother, and she's going to grow up without her dad because of such a very piss poor decision. Anywho, that's the end of this case. I do have another case coming up. I have a ton of information already researched about it. The thing is, just putting it all together, it's going to be a long one, because it's such a case that needs so much attention. It hasn't gotten the attention it deserves, and I want to do it justice. And that is going to be the case of Molly Young. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this, and that you'll be with me for our next episode. And other than that, I will catch you guys on the flip side.